Every 6 days in Canada, a woman is killed by her intimate partner.
From the very beginning, they were suffering horrific levels of physical and emotional and sexual abuse. And we were horrified. We understood that these were going to be women that were in very bad relationships and marriages, but we hadn't comprehended the level and the consistency of the horrific stories that we heard.
My husband at the time was out drinking and doing drugs most of the time, coming home and playing head games and making accusations and stuff like that, and making life just miserable. Ended up with a bit of an argument, and not a bit of an argument, it was quite an argument. And I ended up getting clipped on the back of the head. I lost my balance, came up off the floor, and I went across the hall and I called the police. And I said, you know, I was telling them what happened. And then they asked him a few questions, and then turned around and told me to behave myself. I phoned the marriage counselor and I says, look, I don't know where I'm going to go, but I got to get out of here. And she introduced me to, there's a place called Interval House. I says, okay, I'm going to go for it.
We had quite a time figuring out what the name was going to be, and we didn't want to have words like distress and crisis in the name. And so then we had this big debate about, well, what is this experience going to be? And we decided that it's, you know, that it was a space and a time outside of normal life. So literally it would be an interval between a life that a woman had with her kids where things were not going well at all, time to actually pause, to be safe, to have people around her who cared about her and who were helping, and then she could make her plans, she could get the help she needed, and then she could step back out into the world.
When we first started Interval House, of course, there were no prototypes at all. And so everything we did, we developed as we went along, including finding the location, including advertising, including finding funding. So at that time, we were really operating on a shoestring. The original Interval House was in a former boarding house that we had to sort of paint and fix up ourselves. There was no furniture, that we begged and borrowed from people we knew. There were no intake procedures. There was no schedule for the 12 staff who were there in the beginning. We had to figure all those things out, including the services that we were going to provide to women and children who had the courage to take up their lives and come and stay there.
They were an ear. I talked a lot. I was so wound up and so upset most of the time that that kept me stable, kept me somebody to talk to.
I think it's important to remember that at that point in time in 1973, people were really not talking about domestic violence. And when we first started going around trying to find funding and talking to various levels of government for support, there was still a pretty prevalent belief that this was not nearly as big a problem as we were making it out to be.
Our first young woman was, I think, about 17 years old. We didn't have any beds yet. She slept on the couch. We finally scrounged a couch, and she slept on the couch in the living room. And our first residents were all very young, if I remember correctly. They were all really young.
There really was an incredible span from the women who would just be there one overnight to women who would stay for 6 or 8 months because they had, you know, really serious, persistent, ongoing violence and abuse and harassment going on.
We actually did not formally publicize our location because there was a lot of concern about the safety of the residents. Not so much our own personal safety, but the safety for the residents who were escaping, literally escaping, kind of violence that could have ended up in their death.
We had a lot of security concerns, but we didn't really have any security system. So our security system was, we didn't even have, we might have had a little chain lock inside the door, but literally what we did was open the door and say yes, and some big guy in the porch would be saying, you know, I know my wife's in there, and tell her to get out here. And we'd say, I'm sorry, she doesn't want to talk to you. You'll have to leave, or we're calling the police. Boom, shut the door. It was one day at a time with the police, because of course the actual institution of policing didn't know anything about us. So every single police officer who came to the door had to be educated. And sometimes that went well and sometimes it didn't. And sometimes we would have women in the house whose spouses were police officers. So, you know, we had some pretty tricky moments with the police visits.
I'm just thankful that I was part of it. It's just wonderful women I worked with, and pretty much saved me being there. Just doing something that was really meaningful, and just being with these strong, supportive women was energizing and very fulfilling.
It's so interesting to be sitting here some 40-some years after the founding of Interval House and to feel glad that the shelter movement and the women today that are working in the shelter movement are making such a critical, immediate difference in saving women's lives. And at the same time, to use it as a barometer and to see how far we've come, but how far we still need to go if we're going to eradicate violence against women in this country.